Know that we are recording this session, and I wanted to welcome you to the Summer 2025 webinar hosted by the Global and Non-Western Scholars Standing Group of the Conference on College Composition and Communication. We're incredibly pleased that you're here. We know that you have other things to do. My name is Therese Graben. I'm currently the chair of the standing group. I'm also joined by my colleague Donghong Liu, who's the associate chair of the standing group, and I'm also joined here by some other officers of the standing group. I wanted to just very briefly go over some protocol. Again, this meeting will be recorded and we're going to archive it, hopefully on our YouTube page. So if at any time you feel uncomfortable unmuting, that's perfectly fine. You will have an opportunity to submit your questions via private chat. I will also ask that you keep your camera and microphone unmuted until such time as you're asking a question, because we're running this as a meeting, not a webinar, as you've noticed, so you all are visible and audible. And what I'd like to do is just make sure the speakers are spotlighted. Again, when you're ready to ask a question, if for any reason you're unable to unmute, just paste the question into the chat and one of the co-hosts will read it on your behalf. I'm going to start just by very briefly introducing one of our speakers. Dr. Mijanur Rahman is an assistant professor of writing studies in the Department of English at Cal State University, Los Angeles. He's a teacher scholar originally from Bangladesh. He brings interdisciplinary expertise in applied linguistics and writing studies with a focus on equity-focused and multilingual and translingual writing pedagogy.
Dr. Abraham Romney is an associate professor of English at Idaho State University, a former NEH grantee and a former ISHR research fellow. He studies histories and theories of rhetoric with a few different research areas, including 19th century rhetoric in Latin America and contemporary approaches to rhetoric and the teaching of writing.
And now that we've given brief introductions, Donghong is going to paste their full bios into the chat. I will then paste abstracts into the Zoom chat, and we're going to begin right away by inviting our guest speakers each to take about 10 minutes. Dr. Rahman, please.
Thank you, Dr. Graban and Dr. Liu, for having me here. Well, am I able to share my screen? Okay. If you can see this. All right. Good morning, everyone from Southern California. We have a lot of things going on, but it's a great opportunity for us. It's an honor for me to talk about the webinar today, Translanguaging, Inclusivity, and AI. So on my end, I'm going to share perspectives on how, as a teacher scholar, I engaged with these concepts in recent times. So I just first want to acknowledge the crisis discourse, I would say, that currently exists surrounding generative AI technologies and how we are writing in academic settings. So like in my university, recently the university spent millions of dollars to make generative AI technologies accessible to the students. Now, that kind of coincides with the kind of discourses swirling around or the ideas that we are sharing with people around the world, actually, about how generative AI is affecting our writing. Like MLA forces on task force on writing an AI, they identified in their first paper, they published 3 papers so far. In the first one, they said students may face increased linguistic injustice because LLMs that are at the base foundation of these generative AI technologies promote an uncritical normative reproduction of standardized English usage that aligns with dominant racial and economic power structures. So, they also say that worldwide LLMs may also perpetuate the dominance of English. So it kind of raises the kind of awareness about the risk of this technology in in kind of uh, sustaining a kind of ideology that writing studies as a whole try to problematize over time, right? A student in one of my classes said, okay, whenever I see generated writing is too clean. And another student said, I don't see myself and my voice in this writing because it just seems too corporate. So now this clean written English is like the holy grail of US composition classrooms. This has been the aspirational goal of US composition classrooms since its beginning. And instructors in a writing classroom space wanted to get rid of anything that doesn't look like clean written English. And that appeared in students' errors in spelling, punctuation, and mechanics, right? But it also involved some stronger forms of rhetorical organizations, like alternative methods of content organization beyond deductive, topic sentence based presentation of information. And this is a practice that Paul K. Masuda said that promotes unidirectional English monolingualism. Now, a linguistic justice framework has frequently challenged such uniformity, such a move towards clean written English in the classroom, and it begins with the 1974 Forces Statement on Students' Right to Their Own Languages. It was mostly focused on dialectal variety at that point, but then in recent times, the emergence of translingualism that promoted the idea of translanguaging as a legitimate rhetorical practice, linguistic practice, it came up as an intellectual movement. And we know how it kind of led to the explosion of literatures around translanguaging, code meshing, and things like that. So this translingual research, scholarship, and pedagogical practice not only legitimized the stronger forms of language differences, the rhetorical differences that are often culturally influences across the world, it also encouraged more visible ways of incorporating home dialects, languages, and other non-textual semiotic modes in the process of academic text construction. So code meshing, which I consider is the written version of translanguaging. So translanguaging in general is kind of an idea where we talk, right? We speak with multiple languages. But then code meshing is a written version of it that promotes the linguistic inclusivity. Now, the argument currently is like that the possibility of students adopting different types of generative AI technologies as principal tools to clean up their writing and to make it look more professional and academic threatens the promotion of interlingual and intralingual diversity in academic writing practices. And as I said before, as a teacher scholar at a minority serving institutions in Southern California, I wanted to test these ideas, focusing on a corpus of teaching philosophy statements produced in the context of a writing pedagogy course that I taught for pre-service teachers. And I wanted to share some of the insights from that project here in the next few minutes available. I have a lot of materials, but I will stop right at kind of 10 minutes frameworks so that I can possibly answer some of the questions later. So the question I asked is, what makes students' original statements of teaching philosophy different from those produced by generative AI tools? And how do those differences speak to our ability to engage with translingual writing practices? So this is a screenshot of the assignment that I did in that class, that they will develop a philosophy of teaching writing in California's public schools. And we read a guide to composition pedagogies as a key text on top of many other scholarly articles. And I specifically told them not to use AI in developing the original statement, that it has to be theoretically informed, as we read in the classroom settings, and they need to write like 700 words. So this is what we did overall. So at first, I asked my students to generate a teaching philosophy with a common prompt, but just changing the details of the individuals. What they produced teaching philosophy statements all by themselves through Microsoft Copilot, and then they submitted their original teaching statements at the end of the project in there. And to complement that, I later kind of used Chat GPT 4.0 after the class ended here in recent times. So to see whether these statements look exactly like the one we see in Microsoft Copilot. So I did a guided content analysis comparing the first set and the second set, and I also repeated the same analysis with the third set. And interestingly, I also used ChatGPT 4.0 as a data analysis tool in the process. Now, I looked at the teaching philosophy statements in terms of the clarity of presentations, in terms of the instructional expertise that claim for themselves, and use of personal experience and positionality. It's the question answering what makes you you. So, and I also looked at code meshing and some aspects of linguistic practices in there when it comes to lexical choices and lexical density. I also looked at syntactic complexity of the sentences that students wrote, and it refers to the average length of the sentence. It refers to how many clauses are there in a particular sentence. So that refers to a certain complexity. So in my findings in this short project, I came up with I focused on a few things that kind of stand out for me as a teacher. So when I looked at the Copilot generated statements of the students, what I found is an example of what scholars would say autonomous discourse. Autonomous discourse is what, or literacy practice is what we see every written act or written text as an independent entity that makes meaning all by itself, no matter what the context is, right? So ChatGPT or even Copilot, when they generate statements, they create it as an independent text, like it makes sense as a whole. You don't need to refer to the context as much. And these statements are also well organized with consistent use of section headers, bullet list, and numbered list of ideas, listing that bothers you to an extent at some point. But the student author statements, they are not that kind of autonomous discourse in themselves in here. They are following what Kanagaraja said, negotiated literacy model to some extent. So it requires some form of negotiation because it requires an understanding of where this educated is coming from, especially my students coming from this Los Angeles area with the cultural and linguistic diversity being part of their literacy practices and things like that. And the students' statements are also formatted more like narrative essays or free-form reflections, and it didn't have the same headings and lists because the samples I provided did not have those headings and lists. Now, when it comes to the personal experiences in answering the questions of what makes you you, the specific unique parts of it, the Copilot generated statements refer to the cultural background, but they do as a kind of lip service, that we included in the prompt, but does not illustrate personal lived experiences as a factor for instructional design for these students. And these are also too generic and too repetitive. And when I read all these statements, I feel like after I read one or two, I don't want to read the rest of the statements because they all look very similar, right? But that is not the case when I looked at the students' original author statement. So they had frequent emotional use of personal experience in this case, and they reflect on their past educational experiences, linguistic journeys, and moments of academic failure. So that is an interesting aspect of the differences here because it's like they like to share their vulnerabilities and use that as a motivation to become empathetic and supportive teachers. So it's also what I might say confessional mode, making these statements heartfelt and relatable. And the more I read, I thought, okay, I could read more. It doesn't bore me as it engages me a lot more than the first set of statements. Now, when it comes to translanguaging in there, the Copilot generated statements, they do not explicitly code mesh. They have generic awareness of linguistic diversity in Los Angeles by using words like cultural tapestry, mosaic of languages and cultures in diverse Los Angeles. But they do not explicitly code mesh. Again, I did not ask students to code mesh. I did not prompt them this way. I wanted to see how exactly they do when they are not prompted in general. So student statements also do not explicitly code mesh per se, but there is a but in here. I'll shortly mention that. Although some statements mention the diversity of students' backgrounds or language challenges, few take the next step of celebrating linguistic hybridity in academic text constructions. But some do show incorporation of spoken language conventions, of incomplete, all those run-on sentences, often sentence fragments in some cases, but that shows they're speaking. And I also looked at the lexical density aspect of it, and this is an interesting finding in here. This is not about translanguaging, but it shows what those statements, how those statements are different from the AI generated one. So if you see here, I created this visual by using ChatGPT 4, and it had one minor mistake. It begins with 0 instead of 1, but the overall information is accurate in here. So it counts calculates the lexical density of the statements. So lexical density refers to the fact like it counts the overall words in that statement and then counts the unique words. So excluding the repeating words in that, and then it divides it to get a score in here. And if you see the first set, which is the copilot generated statements, it has a high lexical density. If it's on top in across these statements in here. But the second line you see at the bottom, that is the student author's statements of teaching philosophy. So consistently, almost in all cases, students' statements of philosophy are less lexically dense. Now, if you notice here, there is one example here, a ninth statement. It is the same in lexical density score, almost the same. And once I analyzed this and I went back to my courseware to see, okay, what happened to these statements, and I found out that student actually used AI content substantially. So I gave that student a warning and just and give them the chance to revise the essay to get the passing credit on that assignment. So it shows that the student kind of used AI in writing that statement substantially, and that is reflected in the lexical density scores. And on the syntactic complexity scores, we see that students' sentences are more syntactically complex. You see the second set in here is the average clause density and average sentence length. We see the red bars in here are referring to the student statements, and they are longer and they are okay. So their sentences are more complex, and it refers to the fact that students are writing complex sentences, a lot more complicated one than the AI generated text. But then it also refers to the fact that students' sentences are a lot more, often it has involved complicated sentences. So that is a characteristic of more of an spoken language than written language. So there are some grammatical issues in there that makes the sentences apparently complex in there. So on that note, I saw this analysis, and then what I did later is that I built a new prompt, and I used ChatGPT 4 Edu, and I used explicit instructions on code meshing in this case, like use some text from the Bengali language to represent linguistic identity. And the next time I also used the identity of a 23-year-old African-American male and a 23-year-old Latina educator of English. And these gave me wonderful teaching statements. So if you want to access those teaching philosophy statements, you can possibly scan the QR code. I don't have much time here. Maybe I should come back if anyone wants those. But there are a lot of differences in here. When I used ChatGPT 4, I found more confident and intentional looking uses of code meshing. It includes the first language of the supposed educator in here, Bangla, Spanglish, and African American vernacular English, are central to how these hypothetical teachers frame language, power, and pedagogy. And they also add a level of specification and personal experience that we do not see in the first set, And I did that with Copilot, but I didn't find the same complexity level of complexity in here. So at the end, my final thoughts on this conversation is that, well, when I'm talking about generative AI or AI, not all generative AI tools are the same. Some have more capacities than others. So ChatGPT 4 is a lot more advanced than Copilot, leading to different outcomes. And translingualism or the idea of inclusivity in language is not dead, or it's not threatening our translingual movement just because we now have access to generative AI technologies and might use them to develop our writing. What happens is that, okay, these technologies are continually evolving, and tools like ChatGPT 4 have already built into them capacities to achieve translingual goals. So my point is here that in the evolutionary path of literacy development, humans have just added to the repertoire another resource, and there is no going back. A translingual educator can now easily model their versions of translingual writing, uh, showing them what they say through these technologies. But there are other thoughts on that as well. So with that, I'm gonna stop sharing my PowerPoints. Thank you very much.
Mijan, thank you. I know it's very hard to present research that rich in 10 minutes, but we will have time for Q&A. I'd like to invite Abraham Romney.
Thank you very much, and thanks for that fascinating presentation. I'm going to follow up on that. Let me share my slides here with a little bit of a connection, starting off in a similar place. Can everybody see my slides?
Yes.
Okay. So I wanted to talk about something from the MLA and 4C's Joint Task Force. I'm going to start with that anyway, that Dr. Rahman mentioned. And you're right that there's a focus on clean language. I like the way you emphasize that. In this case, in an attempt to address the emerging problem of generative AI in language studies, this task force, and this is from their first working paper, they took a rather sanguine claim based on the perception of what I would say is a largely benign technology that approximates human writing and could lift students to using more sophisticated grammar. And here they reference the language of power, this idea that writers from diverse backgrounds could, through this technology, gain access to the language of power. And this reference alludes to decades of conversation about edited academic English, as African-American scholar Lisa Delpit put it in a 1992 interview. Edited English is the language of power. If you don't have access to edited English, you don't have access, excuse me. If you don't have access to edited English, you don't have access to the power institutions in this country. This position and more radical ones since have fueled much debate and, dare I say, contention in the writing studies community. And I'm not going to get into that in this talk, but my argument here is that the language of power is much less stable in the context of generative AI. And in some ways, it's increasingly less human. I'm going to follow up on that statement here in a bit. Let me talk about it right now. So here's one of the reasons why it is it's sophisticated, but not necessarily human, this idea of the language of power. So a study published just this year notes differences between human and Gen AI outputs, ranging from syntax and vocabulary to outdated and outsized use of particular words. These differences in output vary across different language models, and the more that models are aligned and fine-tuned, ironically, the less flexible they seem to be in terms of context. And you may have observed this in your own classroom if you are reading student writing, that sometimes there's a genre mismatch when they're using AI outputs. Something that an expert would catch and correct, but a novice might not catch because the output, as I've heard students say, sounds more professional. And this has led to the introduction of some interesting words that are, harken back to previous eras that were more words that would have been more in use in maybe a belletristic text or something. But I love this sentence that the authors talk about: the camaraderie was palpable, generated by GPT 4.0, which is not something that most humans say, apparently. Um, Multilingual capabilities have now entered the conversation, and increasingly we hear about multilingual capabilities of AI models and various AI software services. You've probably seen ads for language learning apps. This first one here is an audio. This is from Google's Notebook LM. You can now create audio overviews of texts in multiple languages. Duolingo's using AI for its simulated chats. And you've probably seen ads like this one that I screenshotted here on Instagram that are pushing for software like JumpSpeak, similar kind of software where you have simulated immersion through AI. I wanted to just give a brief here, rough timeline of some of the highlights of the multilingual capabilities in LLMs. When BERT was released in 2018, it had significant ability to do cross-lingual tasks, and they released a multilingual version trained on a set of languages. Initially the model was trained only on English monolingual data, and later models like GPT-3. GPT-2, there was some mention of its ability to translate into French without any training in translating into French. And by GPT-3, the ability was found to increase as the model scaled up. One paper referred to this ability to do zero-shot tasks across languages as a sort of interlingua, which think is a fascinating term to think of a language model as performing that kind of inter-translation space. And then some of the multilingual models are also speech models focused more on speech recognition and machine translation. And by 2024, the large language model manufacturers were racing to include more languages across their models. As you can see, in 2023, Google's Palm 2 could understand over 100 languages. Meta's massively multilingual speech model could do over 1,000, and they continue to grow that number. Google's is part of their universal speech model goal, which is the 1,000 language projects, and Meta has their No Language Left Behind initiative. And increasingly, OpenAI is including this ability to work faster in more languages in its services. Now, of course, there's a motivation here for these companies to reach more. We're going to be cynical, there's a motivation to reach more people and more customers, but there's also motivation to some positive motivations I'll talk about here in a second in terms of helping to preserve languages that are not represented as much on the internet or in this technology. Now, in this field of natural language program or processing, there are some terms that are used that do present a couple of issues, and one of the terms is low resource languages. The logic around low resource language makes some sense. These are languages for which digital data is sparse, so they're not widely represented on the internet where data can be scraped. Data contamination refers to instances where training data unwittingly ends up with elements of tests within them, so it makes the test less accurate. And sometimes these tests enter the data in other languages, and then they get translated by the model, leading to what they call cross-lingual contamination. And there's nothing necessarily nefarious about this terminology, but it does, from the perspective of translingual and rhetorical studies of language, it introduces a certain monolingual perspective. And the use of dataset contaminations seems to emphasize not the test performance in this last example, but contamination simply from the presence of non-English languages. This is Sesame's conversational speech model. This continues to be the talk of the way of talking about it, though, these emerging abilities that were not necessarily trained into the model. Now, recently, the use of low resource languages was critiqued by Nagatu et al. They dismantle the term low resource language as an imprecise and misleading label that obscures more than it reveals. Drawing on systemic review of 150 ACL conference papers, they show that few researchers define what makes a language low resource in the first place, whether it's data availability, speaker population, or technological infrastructure. The term actually flattens critical differences, lumping together languages as diverse as Hindu, Zulu, and Arabic, despite their vastly different levels of digital support. And worse, it frames the issue as a deficit within the languages themselves rather than as a problem created by NLP systems that prioritize dominant language data. And despite all these efforts, the Zeno's paradox is interesting here because no matter how far we get in bringing these other languages on board, there will be continued progress, and English models will likely always be ahead of the other so-called low resource languages. There's also a move to, in my view, erase some of the differences in language through a kind of transparency. Here's Lex Friedman talking about his use of, I'm going to share my sound. I realized I didn't share that. Sorry about that.
How do you think? O sea, a modo de consejo, ya que lo estamos platicando, a diario, ¿qué opinas sobre los problemas difíciles del mundo?
So here, this view is not uncommon with the way we talk about machine translation and technologies like this. Here we are. Lex Friedman is saying that he's actually speaking Spanish, even though he's obviously not. Within English language models alone, there have been significant concern about linguistic leveling being accelerated by generative AI, perpetuating bias, correcting dialectical variation. And this isn't too surprising given the study mentioned earlier that sees less flexibility resulting from more alignment and fine-tuning in terms of the output of generative AI. And as I mentioned, there are some, I think, pretty altruistic motives in preserving indigenous languages and bringing them to the table. No Language Left Behind team worked to scale neural machine translation to more than 200 languages, including data that is moves a long ways beyond English. And they are trying to find ways to expand the data sets that they can train these models on. Most dual language data sets have been reliant on translations of the Christian Bible. They're trying to data scrape and find things that are publicly available that create additional data that they can use to study other languages. Now, some indigenous groups have feared that this threatens their culture to some extent, and there are ongoing concerns about that. And that brings the question of whose resource is this? And this here I'm also thinking of some scholars like Bott and Martin Jones when they talk about critical language awareness, reviewing the use of the idea of language as a resource, which has a decades-long tradition as a kind of pluralistic view of languages. We talk about low resource languages, but these languages still are a resource, and they're a resource for whom? So that's one of the questions I think we could ask a little bit more in discussion. And I just wanted to mention this translingual approach. I think we need to not just make students aware of language inequality, but recognize the rhetorical skill that they already bring to navigating these language norms. And I've been thinking about ways that I can incorporate this into the classroom. So just briefly, as I'm out of time here, I wanted to just share this sample assignment that I created for students, which in my technical writing class, I had them translate their instructions. So instructions are a traditional thing to do in a technical writing class, but instead of just writing instructions, I had them translate those and then work with their own linguistic knowledge and that of native speakers to decide if the translations that they were able to produce with AI were useful, accurate, or had issues with them. And I'd be happy to talk more about that and other things in our discussion. So I will end there.
Thank you, Abraham. Yeah, thank you for your lecture. So it's so enlightening. Yeah, the topic, yes. So we are very interested in the topic. In our country, my students also doing something related to AI in language teaching and even in writing. But your idea is quite fresh to me. Okay. So, okay, let's say maybe some people have some questions to ask you. Therese?
And please,
Have-
if you can use your hand raising function, and Dong Hong will call on you, and I'll do my best to
Mhm.
repeat your questions in the chat, type your questions in the chat.
Mm.
Chris, please.
Thank you. I'm particularly interested in I had the term the language of power, which is totally familiar to me. I just because I grapple with this within classes. Have you either of you run into the situation where you are showing your students the difference between a large language model output and their own output, starting with their own output, giving them, like, saying, okay, here's what you came out with. Like Mr. Rahman said, here's the diversity of thought and the complex sentences. Now take this, put it into an AI, come out, and then ask them in dialogue about which they like better. And if you've had that discussion, how did that come out?
I can take this question. So I did try that in my first year writing class. Actually, we wrote we do a kind of a genre ethnography where students produce a memo reflecting on their critical analysis of genres in a specific social setting, like a restaurant or a bus stop or things like that. And I did this same activity where, okay, they turn in the memo. And then in another class, I introduced them to the ChatGPT features where I asked them to reproduce the same memo. Um, and and then reflect in a later business letter assignment where they talked about the differences they saw in these two different types of outputs, and how their AI policy should be in future as a writer and things like that. So the majority of the students came up with the with like they came up with the idea that when they're writing their own memos, there is a kind of imprint of the person, like who they are, because they actually went to a place. They know about that place a lot more. They have this contextual understanding of what happens in that spot. So what happens in this AI generated writing, it loses the complexity of the contextual factors involved in understanding text in real life settings. So that is a big difference. But then that they like the fact that, yeah, ChatGPT are creating sentences that look professional, so that part is appreciated. Edited American English is a source of power, and that is a lot more so for my students because they come from bilingual, multilingual households, and they don't grow up speaking English as the mainstream language. So what happens is like it's a big jump. In fact, our university used the same rationale that ChatGPT and all other generative AI technologies, they are an important educational equity tool. We're making the playing field even for everybody. Now, are we? My concern is that, look, the ChatGPT or the other AI tools are writing professional looking clean English. That's fine. But no matter how good it is, that is not your writing. So if you are kind of dependent on these tools to develop your the writing output, then you are in a serious, I mean, in a sensitive spot here, because the person who spoke English as the mainstream, like the tool for communication growing up as part of the language socialization, they don't have mass problem with making sentences that look like edited American English, right? My students, they have that problem. Now if they skip from their own writing to the chat gpt writing immediately, they're missing out on an opportunity to develop their own literacy skills. So in that sense, these tools are creating dangers for a lot of students who kind of might want to find a shortcut in getting things done in instructional settings. Thank you. That's
That was precisely the debate that erupted in the class, because one of my multilingual students volunteered to have their paragraph altered or taken into a GPT, into a large language model, and the debate was, well, you've lost the person's voice, and the other side was, yes, but this allows us to mimic the language of power. So thank you very much for that response.
Yeah, can I just add to that? I think that's a great question. And I'd like to do more with that specific exercise with that question in mind. But one thing that I've also emphasized is I noticed that there's a lot of talk, and even the working papers have focused a lot on invention, right? On coming up with ideas being a safe way to use generative AI. A lot of teachers, you'll hear teachers say that, well, I don't mind if you use it to come up with ideas, but you need to do the writing yourself. And I've tried to have students put a lot more into the prompt, a lot more into their coming up with an idea first before they go to generative AI for that reason, because I think there's something actually human about creativity. So then it's interesting though to think about, does that get flattened when the output then comes out of it? But I think that Dr. Rahman's example, which I found intriguing, when you tweaked the prompt more and gave more specific instructions into things like code meshing, that you do see a different kind of output coming from that. So I think that's just kind of to add to that keeping some of your power in the creative part of it is important.
Thank you both. Thank you, Dr. Rahman.
Shaquille, please.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for a really interesting talk. My question from both of you this is a comment for all of us, like, how do we think this generative AI is sort of influencing new views around language, that is language ideology? Because one of the things I recognize is like digitality has had a real context like shift in how students and all of us think of language, that is the visual in the sort of 5 dimensions of literacies, like linguistics, visual, spatial, embodied, gestural, and all of those. Seems like visuality has become prioritized. Like they include pictures, graphs, charts, and we teach for that. We don't necessarily teach about gestures or pauses or all of this in aspects of communication. So the digitality has impacted the view of communication that is before it was primarily linguistic, that the sentences have to be correct and all of this stuff. Now there's also visuality. The graph has to be used. We need to teach graphs. So it's been added there. That's the impact of digitality. So given this context, how are we understanding what is generative AI going to do that hypercharges or changes or adds on this digitality from what you're seeing? Is there going to be more sort of emphasis on like it doesn't matter, we can just speak whatever we want in whatever order we want without sort of a sense of coherence in our thought process, and the AI will generate the coherence for us and we'll be fine with it? Or is it going to be something else? If that as a way of like thinking how it'll impact stuff in the future, like 10 years of a sense of what language is thoughtful.
Let me just were you gonna say something, Dr. Rahman?
No, please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me just comment on your question about coherence. I think is interesting because there's a move right now toward Gen AI refusal. Some people say I don't want to use it at all, right? And I don't really want my students to use it. And I think, I'm sympathetic to some of the arguments there, but one of the kind of tenets of that is that we didn't ask for this. It was kind of thrust upon us. But I think that in the writing process, it is kind of messy. And I know that as a PhD student writing my dissertation, I remember wishing for this exact technology, something that could take all my thoughts and then generate some coherence. So I think that's actually a pretty neat observation. I think it's something that students probably will do is here are all my ideas, generate some coherence here for me. Whether or not that's a good thing, I'm not sure. But I think that speaks to the usefulness of these tools as summarizers. That's in some ways they're better at summarizing than they are at generating unique things, but grabbing a lot of disparate things in a larger text and then boiling it down to something summarized, I think is something we will continue to use a lot. I think even that actually has to do with not so much the multimodal things you were talking about, but also our own literacy, right? Reading. I think more and more people are going to rely on summaries from AI than actual reading in a kind of larger sense.
Yeah, just to add to that. So, I mean, when I think of what is happening to our existing language ideologies, so my overall uptake on this interaction with generative AI tools is that these tools are going to amplify what we value uh, in our writing outside those AI tools. Like they're being trained on all sorts of data right now. It's more inclusive than it was before. So if we continue to privilege edited American English, for example, in the US, or edited English, people are going to use it that way. So it's not just one way thing where the AI is directing you to do something, right? It is also how we are interacting with it. So yes, if we prefer in our assignments that it has to be exclusively a text-oriented writing assignment, right? No emojis, no visuals, no charts or graphs. Then that's what people are gonna do, and they're just going to use these generative AI tools as an assistance kind of mechanism. So that's like, overall my ideas on this generative AI conversation is that it's not taking away all the evils that we have created, we humans created in instructional space, in literacy practices. It is just gonna do possibly the same thing that we do, and sometimes it's just worse. We cannot expect AI to solve all our problems. We have that agency. So when I engage with generative AI tools in my classrooms, I focus on that okay, you are the person who is choosing to do all these things. So it's not like you are imposed on like all these ideas are not being imposed on you unilaterally. You have the chance for negotiation in that. So what kind of text we want to see? Yeah, that's coming from what we think what writing is, and we're just gonna use those features in here. Thank you.
Wonder if I can ask a follow-up question. And actually this might follow up quite well from what Dr. Rahman just shared. My question is similar, but I'm interested in how we think generative AI might be influencing new views of genre. And to offer some context, I've been trained in a tradition that sees genre and invention as very closely tied. And the construction or reconstruction of genre is not so much striving for a pre-existing form as it is creating knowledge all over again in response to a particular situation that the writer is navigating. And so, Dr. Romney, when you mentioned that it's quite possible that generative AI is helping us summarize better, that led me to sort of ask what are our expectations of what a summary is and how have those evolved. But so, that's just context for the question, which is fairly simple, and I'm interested in your thoughts on that. How might this be influencing new views of genre?
I think that's a really great question. And it's something I've thought a little bit about because there was a kind of, I would say almost a mashup kind of mentality with ChatGPT when it first came out, do this thing, but in this other voice, or write to this audience as if you were writing, this thing where there was kind of playfulness to it. And I find that that's interesting with the fine tuning. As it seems like the outputs increasingly have a kind of structure to them that is not dictated as much by the prompt as it is by the the training that it's undergone and the things that are in the context window that we can't see, right? That it is instructing itself to do deep research, for example. If you've played with that, it's got a format and a genre to the way those research reports are being generated. So I guess some of those genre things will probably be part of the training that will shape the way we see genre. But I imagine that it's also going to be more about what we can do with the outputs and putting them into our own genres, and there might be some changes there. But that doesn't really fully answer your question, but just a thought toward, I think that it seems to be right now kind of coalescing around certain kinds of output and expectation. Create a PowerPoint slide for me, create this for me. There are things that it is pulling from genres in its data set, but also those things are getting a little bit more uniform in the way that it outputs them.
Yeah, to add to that, when I see genre, I see, these are is cognitive tools, right? They're the tools to participate in the knowledge formation in the academic discourse communities, or to participate in whatever communities you are part of, right? And I also see genres of writing are accomplished differently in different cultural context, whether that is a small culture or big culture, however you define it. Now, yeah, I see Dr. Romney, what said. Yeah, like people initially, at least, like a lot of people thought that, okay, chat gpt, generative AI, they're very good on genres, especially in copying or imitating the dominant genre conventions on those. But those genre conventions are what conventions are here in the US, for example, because most of the training data are coming from here. Now, the problem with that is that genres are accomplished differently in different places, in different contexts, and ChatGPT is not really is a good tool to bring that out in here. And I agree with Dr. Romney that it is creating uniformity, a lot more uniformity in the genre production process than before, because as an applied linguist, as a second language writing enthusiast, I feel like, okay, yeah, we should keep those genre differences alive because they reflect on certain values that we practice in our communities, right? So yeah, that's a complicated problem, and it is reducing inclusivity in that sense, to tie it to the topic of the webinar today.
Thank you. Thank you both. I think we have time for one more question. And I've been getting requests in the private chat. If you have a question that you'd like to include, please type it in the private chat, and one of the hosts will ask the question on your behalf. Desmond, please.
This is a very interesting kind of discourse going on, and I just wonder if any of the panelists, that what is the place value when it comes to equity in using the required edited language of power? That makes it somewhat a bit kind of lost when it comes to the intricacies of using large language models in academia. I don't know if this is clear or I should reiterate. So what I mean is we're talking about I'm asking or want to have a more general idea when it comes to the place value of equity. So especially when it comes to second language users of the edited language, which is English, people come from different backgrounds, and how they may use language in their backgrounds will be quite different in their new setting where American English predominantly is required. So when we are talking about equity, what's the place value? What is the new dimension of constructive understanding of it? That when it comes to the use of large language models, it leverages them not in a way to, for them to, in using the large language model, for them to harness what it takes to grow or be a part in the new environment.
I mean, I think it's a really good question in terms of that heavy lift that is being asked of a student coming from that background, right? And I think that was maybe the attitude about this idea that it would give students a leg up, you know, kind of everybody would be able to have access to the language of power. So I mean, I think that I understand why they included that in their statement, but I think that, you know, you point that out, and also Dr. Rahman, your point that if you skip some of the process, then you're also cheating yourself a little bit of the experience if you just are using the AI to get there. So I think, but in terms of that language of power dynamic, I think that's something we still need to question, you know, whether or not edited academic English is the be all end all or should be for everything that we assign students.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. So, on my end, yeah, I see that as a tool for promoting equity in classroom settings, right? Especially for students. I mean, this could be multilingual students working outside the US for writing academically, or within the US, our linguistically diverse student population, like the ones that we have in Southern California. Like, there are certain things. I mean, just imagine you don't have access to any of these tools. You are still doing things in the old way. And there are some students who have access to these, and they're doing things now in a new way. Like, in terms of academic performance, I think the second group of students will have an upper hand in this case. So on my end, I see that as an equity tool, and I want to, as Dr. Romney said, this is kind of giving them a leg up, or making the playing field a bit even. I want to keep it there. I want to make it accessible to these students, but also telling them that this is what it can do, and this is what it cannot do, and this is what you shouldn't do with it, right? So, like summarizing, for example, the concept. I mean, a lot of students, for example, that first generation college students, they have struggles on how to like actually read a text, right? So when you do that, that's becomes kind of a useful tool. Like, you are summarizing, you're trying to understand the main concepts, and then you are actually reading it. But if they stop reading it, then that's a problem, right? So in another case, like the other day, I was teaching my students, my children actually, Bengali reading and writing. So we picked up a news article from Bangladeshi newspaper, and my son, while he speaks and understands Bengali kind of to an extent, he doesn't have the advanced proficiency in the language. So now, what we did, we used at first, he cannot read fluently, as fluently as I want him to. So he used that read aloud function in Microsoft Edge. So that is a generative AI tool, right? So it read nicely, except for the numbers. It just read the numbers as one digit after another instead of saying the exact number we're talking about. But then he didn't understand many of the words. So he used the automatic translation feature. And then when we kind of tried to break those sentences down a bit further, he used some of the expressions and then found translations of those. He kind of slowed down the speed of this reading aloud feature. So, and that way he was able to understand the text a lot more, and kind of it also helped him gain some kind of autonomous learner autonomy, where I don't have to do everything now. There are problems with the technologies, but it gives him that tool. So I think that's the case for all multilingual students as well. If they have access to these tools in this way, yeah, it promotes equity in the learning uh, uh, world. I was saying in all educational settings in here.
Yeah, and if I can just add, I didn't have a whole lot of time to talk about I didn't give myself enough time to talk about the assignment I did, but that was one of the things behind the reason why I had students translate their instructions to another language, because it kind of flipped that equity a bit so that now students who had another language had an advantage versus students who normally would. I couldn't have done this without the AI technology because I couldn't expect someone to translate something to French if they didn't know any French. But here, anybody could try the assignment, but those who had more linguistic knowledge had a little bit of an advantage. So I think that we can also think of it that way. What are some things that we can use this technology to ask students to do that we didn't previously think of that are outside of just edited academic English?
We are at 12 o'clock. We do have one more outstanding question from Wei Yuzhu. I've put it in the chat, and it's a question directed at Dr. Rahman. I recognize that some people need to leave, but if folks are able to stay for a few more minutes, that would be wonderful. And so I wanted to invite Dr. Rahman to take this final question. And this is the question. As a teaching assistant at our university, I've noticed that students frequently use AI to assist with their writing. As the standardized output of generative AI becomes the pedagogical norm, how can we construct a critical use pedagogy between technological tools and translingualism? I know this is $1 million question, but if you feel you have a response to share, that would be wonderful.
Thank you. That's really a solid and very important question here. Yes, $1 million question, of course. So these things are happening, right? So again, I go back to my earlier notion of having or claiming our own agency in the process. If as instructors we are preferring those surface level features of no incomplete sentences or sentence fragments or things like that, students are going to use that that way. So I think this is a moment when writing studies scholars, instructors, researchers, they have actually an opportunity to value what they say they traditionally value, the voice. So voice of students writing and the fact that, yeah, it's an authentic piece of writing reflecting the students' positionality and the ideas they wanted to convey, right? So now when I see students writing with an incomplete sentence, I feel happy because I know that, okay, this is my students' actual writing. Now, when I see those complicated or the comma splice or those spelling mistakes in the sentence, then that doesn't bother me anymore the way it used to before, because I see, oh, okay, now that is actual student writing. If I see citation errors in the process of text construction in the final submitted essay, I'm again, this is kind of ironic but paradoxical, but I feel happy with that. Okay, then I'm evaluating an actual human authored text. So it's a time to revise, to rethink, to reconceptualize what we actually value in the writing process. And if we kind of think about that in a more kind of concerted way as part of a discipline, we can kind of deconstruct some of those questionable norms that are pushing students towards those superficial levels of achievements in writing. And thank you very much. That's a question I continue to wonder, and I will keep wondering for quite some time.
I'd like to thank both speakers and my co-host Donghong Liu, and also all the participants. Thank you very much. 1 hour was not enough time, so it's very clear to me that we'll be revisiting these topics again in the fall. I did have several requests sent to me by private chat. Would the speakers be willing to share their slides, or at the very least, offer your email or preferred contact information in the chat so that participants could reach out to you and ask you more questions? If you're willing to do that, that would be wonderful.
Sure, I can share my email in the chat. So I'll be happy to respond to any questions.
Thank you,
Yeah, same.
everybody. Thank you so much. At
Thank
this
you.
point, I will stop the recording. I do hope that you are interested enough to learn more about our group. If you don't already know about our group, I've put a link to our website in the chat. The website is undergoing a little bit of reconstruction, so thank you for your patience.
And thank you for having
Thank
me
you. It's
Of
a
course.
wonderful
Thank you so
webinar.
much.
in mine. Okay. Yeah. That's
Thank you,
fine.
everybody. As soon as I stop the recording, I'll end the meeting. So glad you were able to join us today.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.